The first chapter, the volunteer today is Brandon, and he's going to give us the 10-minute presentation of the chapter. And after that, we will open the forum for the usual discussion and see how we go.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm going to try and keep this within 10 minutes. So this is the first chapter called a Genocide in Gaza. And I guess in terms of the threads that I picked up from reading this book, I mean, the first thing I would say is that it reminded me that just 2 weeks before the 7th of October, I was due to go into the West Bank and do some olive picking and bits and bobs. So I kind of brought all of that back for me and kind of freshened my mind in terms of the reading the chapter. But I think what came through and what was reflected in the chapter, I guess, was this I guess a crisis of faith um, and that sense of people feeling abandoned in the face of this kind of slaughter. And also, what was interesting to me, one of the threads was this struggle that Munther had with this idea of right to resist and how that's defined and all the rest of it. So there's some really interesting stuff in there about that. I think the book talked a lot about this kind of idea that the Nakba hasn't been a one-off event. It's been a continuation from 48 and probably before then of this kind of attempt to eliminate Palestinians from the area. And that this latest this genocide in Gaza is just a continuation of that entire process. I think Munther talked about that hubris, the Israeli kind of assumption that there wasn't any risk of this ever happening, and the shock that it brought to their system, their sense of invincibility, I guess. I think the book was very, very powerful in just talking about the one after the other, these examples of how Israel dehumanizes Palestinians, and the awful example of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old kid, and just the kind of indiscriminate attacks against civilians, and then when people are coming to help civilians, ambulance services and others, they get assaulted as well. I think again that sense that this is now, it's almost like an opportunity to take off the blinkers and just go into overt genocide, rather than a kind of under the radar genocide that many of us feel has been going on, and just the sheer brutality described within incidents. I think the book begins in this chapter to talk about the concept of international law and the West, and that kind of a la carte kind of sense that, depending on where you are in the world and where your alliances are, you may experience international law differently. And then the context of all of this, again, was, I feel, a sense of desperation amongst the Hamas leadership and others, because of what was going on in the geopolitical area around, the Abraham Accords, and there was overtures going on between the Saudis and the Israelis, and it felt like Palestine was just going to be sold out. So that was the kind of context that was touched upon. So going into, just before we go into the rest of it, it's worth just reminding ourselves about Article 2 in terms of what it says about the Genocide Convention, because that's spoken about an awful lot. We know that word genocide came out of the Second World War, and obviously that's what we think is going on here, but it's about that any of the following acts committed with intent, in whole or in part, in terms of killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately imposing conditions of life calculated. If you look at all of these elements of the criteria, they're all met in terms of what's going on. So the book begins, I guess, talking about that whole issue of October the 7th, and a lot of it is very strange. I mean, Israel apparently was aware that there were plans. Again, the hubris, I guess, told them that there was no risk to this; it was unlikely to happen. And I think that that's something that's bubbling away under the surface inside Israel security services and all the rest. So we know that at 6:30, approximately 1,200 Hamas militants attacked, and across 10 different locations. They used boats and paragliders and drones. They attacked IDF bases, villages, the music festival, kibbutzim, cars, and there was carnage. A lot of people were killed. Um, there was a lot of evidence of indiscriminate executions, and there was 250 people kidnapped. And aside from the Hamas militia, there were people came across from what we know came across from Gaza and maybe there was some looting and stuff. And I think that the Israeli response was deemed to be slow. There was, all this issue about the Hannibal Directive in terms of many of those 1,200 people who were killed may have been killed as collateral damage from Israeli fire, and also that the Israeli Hasbara kicked in as soon as this happened, and they were talking about 2,000 people killed. You were just exaggerating as they do. And I think that the immediate response of the West was to, remind everybody that if we needed to be reminded of Israel's right to defend itself, never any talk about people's right to resist occupation, but there you go. And the biblical language from Bibi, mighty vengeance for this black day, and turn Gaza into a deserted island, where, Yov Gallant talking about human animals, and, being explicit about cutting off electricity and food and fuel. And I think, also there was this issue that was going on around Netanyahu's reliance on these, far right characters. And this whole issue of how to respond to what happened, being caught up in Israeli internal politics, in terms of Netanyahu looking at this in terms of how he might benefit from continuing it. And again, the evidence in front of us all is a new Nakba, or a continuation of the original Nakba. So the evidence supporting genocide. Sorry, I need to go back there. Yeah. So South Africa, as we know, brought this case to the International Court of Justice. A lot of very detailed evidence has been provided out of the mouths of Israeli generals and politicians themselves, hoisting themselves on their own petard. And a lot was talked about in terms of the systematic deprival of essential resources, the starvation tactics, the indiscriminate bombing of people's homes, of religious centers and schools and cultural administrative infrastructure, and the repetitive displacement of people. And it was argued on those criteria we talked about earlier that there was vast evidence across the board that this fit the criteria for genocide. And I think, what was interesting was the reaction of, again, the West to South Africa's case, and the US very hostile. Weren't so hostile when it was Ukraine or any of their other geopolitical kind of assets and resources. And again, this mantra from the West: Israel has got a right to defend itself. Of course, there was a vast amount of voices from elsewhere around the world, the global South, or whatever we want to call it, saying, "Hold on a second here. These people are under occupation. This is slaughter from the air that's going on here." But we don't get to hear that in our media in terms of how it's controlled. So the book was quite powerful in trying to represent these, inconsistencies. So the evidence, well, we can see it on our TV screens. You might argue that sea change in people's opinions about what's going on as being primarily these constant images of this kind of desolation in these civilian areas. Non-governmental organizations on the ground providing tons of evidence supporting the case. Lots of evidence of IDF covering up its war crimes. We saw that recent incident of killing the medical professionals and then covering up their bodies and that sort of thing. Lots of leading genocide and Holocaust scholars, many of them Jewish and some from Israel itself, coming out and saying this is clearly genocide. There's no way of dressing this up. And a sense that the burden of proof, and Munther was quite strong on this. It shouldn't lie with the Palestinians and their supporters arguing whether genocide's going on. It should be on those denying it's going on. Well, show up, fess up, show us your evidence. Again, Christian leaders, and I would make that distinction between Christian individuals and activists on the ground and people sitting in offices, air-conditioned offices, sitting on the fence. Munther is really frustrated by that, and I think it really creates a lot of issues for him in terms of being a person of faith, belonging to an organization, a faith organization. And then we have the orange monstrosity from Mar-a-Lago talking about emptying out Gaza and developing real estate on the bones of Palestinians. So in summary, there was a lot of information in that chapter which talked about that kind of a MO of the Israelis in terms of deliberately targeting civilian areas, giving inconsistent information to tell people where they should go and then bombing where they're telling them to go. And, obviously Hind Rajab's experience and the experience of those who went to help her is being repeated hundreds and thousands of times over and over again. There is definitive evidence for genocide. That's the main outcome of this chapter. There is talk about the vast trauma, the unconscionable, unmeasurable trauma that this is inflicting upon people in Gaza and in wider Palestine. The book touches upon issues of the tensions around violence and theology and how faith-based organizations deal with violence. And this Christian dichotomy, I guess, which is really about the behavior of their organizations and their political antics. And then these people who are on the ground in those zones of conflict, trying to help people. And there's a vast chasm of difference between the two. And I think Munther is obviously struggling with that in the book and in his personal life. And then is the other thing the book talks about is that the limits of international law. Again, it seems rather an a la carte issue around international law. It's used to invade countries when we think they've got weapons of mass destruction, and then it's conveniently ignored when it requires people to actually address the behavior of their allies. So that's came across very strong in the chapter as well. So thank you for listening, guys.